Honeybunches. Thank you for coming back for a bit more bookish content. Today it's time for my first What I Read in a Month. Woohoo! Well, I'm getting the sense that this is going to further niche my channel and attract even less views than the ever dwindling norm. I loved reading the comments on my last What I Hope to Read This Year, TBR. So yeah, even though it might be a bit quiet over here, I'm thinking it'll generate some juicy engagement. So please comment. Talking books is so fun. Probably actually enjoy talking books more than I enjoy talking food, because I just like to eat and cook. There's a revelation. This was a really good month for reading. I read 9 books. Okay, there were some graphic novels in there, but a mix of non-fiction and fiction too, and it's essentially down to doing a lot of Merlin raising, which, while is quite like always being around him and 24/7, there's a lot of time where I'm just sort of sitting and just making sure he's not jumping up on things or chewing things he shouldn't. So point being, I've had a lot more time to read, so I doubt this will be sustained. But let's jump in. The first book I read, which I'm gonna count it because it was in that funky week after Christmas and New Year, was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I went into this with a hopeful feeling, even though I've heard so many mixed reviews and people saying they liked less than normal people. And while I like normal people, it didn't leave me feeling good. It left me feeling a bit irky. And I liked the characters so much more in the television series I did in the books, and a similar thing happened here. But I was re-encouraged to read it by a book I read last year, Show Me Where It Hurts, about invisible illnesses, and the author has endometriosis, so that's predominantly the invisible illness she's talking about, her experience. Anyway, she talks and is appreciative of the representation of endo in Conversations with Friends, because the main character, Frances, has it. Although it's not super obvious. It is at the end, but if I hadn't gone in with it with my radar on for that, it might have just slipped by me, which when I was talking to a few friends I got the sense that it would. It's from Frances's perspective, and she is a tough person to like be inside her head, and she has a very critical gaze. I think whether the characters in the book are good people or not, you just kind of end up hating everyone, including Frances. Makes you just feel really irky. But if I had to pick like a favourite character, it would be Nick, which is the person that Frances has like an affair with. He's like 10 years older, but he's like conventionally attractive white guy, so it's like, well, why do I like him the most? An interesting theory I was talking to a friend about was that he sort of reminds me of like a Sally Rooney-ified Edward Cullen, in that he's like perfect, so many of these, perfect in appearances and like charm, but he's very self-hating, and he has a tendency, without trying to spoil everything, to like swoop in and want to save France. Not save her, but like be there for her. That theory probably doesn't hold up the whole way, but yeah, it was very pick-upable. I wanted to keep reading, but it didn't make me feel good. It wasn't a joy. The second book I read was called Vagina Problems, which I just saw on like the new books section in the library, and it reminded me of the other book I just mentioned, Show Me Where It Hurts, which I read in December last year, talking about invisible illnesses, pain, sex and other taboo topics. It's by, I think, a Canadian author who's written for BuzzFeed or a site like that, and it did kind of feel like a BuzzFeed book in that it was very rambly. I feel like it repeated itself a lot and felt like a very long diary entry. But even though I read sort of a similar book, a book on similar themes like the month before, it is this person's experience, which is obviously going to be different, and it had more, I guess, about how endo affects sex and intimacy, or can, for some people. Some sound bites that I wrote down were like, it's really hard to describe pain after the fact, and it talks a lot about women's pain and how it's not believed, which is quite depressing and potentially triggering if you've experienced something like that. Another thing was, someone doesn't have to understand what you're going through to be there for you. Thought that was pretty yes. And physical pain and physical hardships create emotional baggage. There were parts I was like, what are we saying? I thought we just said this a couple of chapters ago. Sort of felt like the book went like this. It did make progress, but it sort of kept going back. Then the third book I read is Plum Dog, which is a graphic novel I just picked up at the library because it had a dog on it. And it's essentially about this author-illustrator, Emma Chichester Clark, about life with her dog, Plum, who I think is a schnauzer, a miniature schnauzer. And it's just a year of walks and socialization and adventures that they go on. And it's very endearing, it's very cute, lots of dogs, loved it. Very cozy. I read it in like 2 sittings. However, had some funny feeling reading this. I'm like, what's my hesitation, my hang up with it? And afterwards I realised this author's relationship with her dog is not a tactile one. She never, I don't think it's like depicted, or you see that she pats Plum, and she definitely doesn't pick her up ever. Their sort of bonding thing and what their relationship is based on is going on walks, which is delightful, but it's just not quite my attitude to dogs. Being close to them and patting them is like one of the greatest joys for both of you sometimes. So when you realise that, you're kind of like, yeah, what's going on? Why not snuggle? But it's very cute and very relatable for any dog lover, and it goes through the seasons. It's a very cozy homebody book, and I really like the illustrations. The next book I read was Stan Grant's Australia Day. Stan Grant is a Wiradjuri and Camilla Roy man, a journalist since 1987. He's worked for the ABC, SBS. He's done like foreign correspondent stuff. He's an author, presenter, etc. I read this in the week before Australia Day, and I think because I thought my timing was so good that I was expecting more about the actual day. But it's not necessarily about that. It's more about the myriad of problems that have led to a country and a society thinking that an Australia Day is a remotely good idea in the first place. So it's a lot more philosophical than I thought it would be. It dapples into his experience as well as relevant history. He talks about like the good, the bad, the ugly that has come with the technological, philosophical and industrial revolutions of the 18th century, the sort of effect of modernity on Indigenous peoples. Talks about how like history repeats itself. He talks a lot about memory and the issues with the very tokenistic apologies that have occurred in this country, and how then it is sort of expected that once we say sorry, Indigenous people will move on, essentially for the sake of like the white person's like conscience, which isn't fair. He sort of makes the point that it's too late to expect total forgiveness. He talks about other countries, how they've moved on, how Australia is the only colonial country who has not acknowledged its Indigenous people in its constitution. And he has like this great quote which is, have we really grown so lethargic on the topic or something? He talks about the irony of how we're so passionate about remembering the Anzacs with the less we forget motto, and how that irony is not lost on Indigenous Australians. So yeah, it's all about the slippery grossness of Australia and its race relations, and he sort of concludes that, yeah, you can change the date of Australia Day or abolish the date completely, but it's not addressing the whole underlying issues, which are so much more complicated and need so much more action than just negotiating a date. And perhaps why that date is such a boiling point is because there's so much yet to be addressed and acknowledged. Oh yeah, another thing that was super interesting is how what we've done with language, like we'll say traditional custodians of the land as opposed to owners, because if we use the word owners, then owners have rights. So yeah, things like that. On a whim this month, when I popped into a bookstore, I purchased Convenience Store Woman. Partly because it's small, I thought I can do that, and I did, and I loved it. So good. It doesn't have any chapters, so I read this in about 2 sittings, but even though it's a short book, it is so descriptive and so detailed. Like the world of the main character, Aiko, is so like in my head, like I can imagine it totally, because her style of writing is very like of the body, the bodily experience. That sounds weird, but I heard her talking about that in a interview where she was describing like the role of a convenience store woman and like how it affects her. So like how she still hears the sounds of the convenience store as she goes to bed at night, and occasionally will like shout out in her sleep about things that need restocking or something. I love like oddball outcast stories. I did find the relationship in it really irky, so I liked the first half of the book better than the second half because of that, but in saying that, it has a really great ending. I love that she's like this 30-something woman that does this job that mainly uni students and I don't know, people do for a short amount of time, and it's actually a job that really helps her be a part of society and just function as a person. And yeah, you're rooting for her the whole way. I really loved it. I could read it again. It's really good. I then read The Space Between Us, Chaos, Questions, Magic, Welcome to Your 20s. Essentially a book about your 20s and what to expect or how it's hard, what they don't tell you in relation to like family, friends, work, your creativity, confidence, health, purpose, etc. The authors have a podcast which is apparently quite popular in Australia at least. They live in Melbourne. They're 26, or they were when they wrote it, so they're very much on the pulse. What am I doing? On the pulse of what it is to be in your 20s now, and they even acknowledge the pandemic because I presume they were finishing it up last year. They certainly had wisdom to share, and even though they're white, able-bodied, thin women, they do acknowledge their privilege and I think do a good job, and like, I am essentially look like them, so who am I to say? But yeah, they make an effort in being intersectional and acknowledging their privilege. There were parts though that I think would be triggering anyway because I'm inevitably doing my 20s in a way that's different to how they are doing it, and they're a bit older, so of course they've had more of their 20s under their belt, but the opportunities they've gotten in the media space, which is where I'm trying to get opportunities, yeah, I got a bit jelly in parts. And even when they're like acknowledging that some internships or whatever were really toxic environments and gross, I was still jealous anyway because it led them to what they're doing now, and I don't know. And yeah, inevitably how they describe things is not the only way, but especially their stuff on family and health, they're very open and honest about. Did make me a bit like can of worms-y about how in the media creative space being personal, it sort of feels like a requirement. And yes, I think we're becoming a bit more respectful, or at least in some circles we are, of like not expecting people to tell their stories. But these two women talk about things which they have never done on their podcast about their health and sex and family and stuff, that I just feel like yeah, wow, it's really powerful that you shared that, and I'm grateful that you did because it probably will help me at some point. But I sort of also felt like we were wringing them dry in this book, like the last final squeeze of like juicy personal tough rough experiences they've been through for the sake of content. I don't know, just something probably is a whole another conversation. Then the next read was Mabel Me by Andrew Cotter. Now, he's the person who did all the Mabel Me videos last year that went viral. Yes, it sort of sounds like a celebrity memoir, but it's so much better than what it sounds. He is obviously talking about his Labradors, talks about his life as a dog person. He sort of does go through the sort of ridiculousness of the overnight success that those videos got, but always with his head screwed on straight. You hear about his life as a commentator, which is really fascinating. I think not really something you would, or I have, ever thought about, or I just don't really give a shit because a lot of the Australian ones are really dumb. And then you hear about his adventures with Olive and Mabel, including this one day when he was doing a couple of the Munros in Scotland, and it was in December. So it was a 12-hour hike with 2 dogs, 6 hours of which was in darkness because he had to start it early, and then the first 3 hours and the last 3 hours of the hike were in total darkness. Like, wow. But he's super witty and a really great writer, and yeah, I don't really care about overnight success stuff, but I'm really glad that it happened because yeah, it's a really good book. Super page turner, really concise, could have been twice as long. Nothing in it was boring, even though, I don't know, you might not think I'm in the super ideal target market for that book. Obviously every story and Labrador bit was made more special to read because I have a Labrador puppy, so it made me very excited for all the adventures to come, so to speak. Then I read another graphic novel, just one that my library has. It doesn't have a great selection at all. All the really good ones are always borrowed. Anyway, I read the Odyssey to dip my toe in a bit of Greek mythology. I would love to be someone who reads like Stephen Fry's mythos at one point in time. I guess it's like when people are ambitious with classics. It's sort of something I feel like I should know, and I did ancient history at uni for a bit. Got the sense that everyone else there had read a bit, you know, read the Odyssey or Troy, and I had not. Anyway, did I enjoy this? No. It's all men with grudges, fighting, sort of living for that shit, and I don't care about upholding honor and keeping grudges. And then there's the gods in this book, which are a cool element, but also like how they act, it's just on a whim all the time. There's no logic to it. The only logic is the gods mean a lot to the people in it. A bit of heterosexual intimacy, one raunchy sex scene. Women are just like tempters and immortal sex people, but there was one scene which sort of redeemed it for me, and it's when there's this troll and he eats a couple of the people in it by squishing them, and you see their bodies burst. So if that's the high point coming from me, he doesn't like gore, yeah. It was really hard to follow, and then when I did get the gist, I'm like, I don't really care. Just live a more peaceful life, everyone. Then the last book I read was Julie and Julia, which I found in an op shop. Totally forgotten about this book because you would think, being a massive fan of the film, I would jump to it. Anyway, I knew I would enjoy this. It differs from the film in that it's 99% Julie Powell and like 1% Julia Child. You get more about her work, her family, her job at a government agency that deals with like a lot of the administration, things that need to be sorted out after 9/11, which she deals with like sort of a black comedy. because it would just be too depressing to feel the full weight of it. And her office was like overlooking the site of the Twin Towers. Her husband in this book comes off way better than he does in the film. They have a much sweeter relationship in this. It's fun for like the blog, like 2002 blogging world insight. Honestly, like insight into life in 2002. Less technology, more like people coming over for dinner. Her mum in this book is a much more interesting person and character than she is in the film. I feel like she's just a stereotype of like a doesn't get it, wants Julie to settle down, like Texan voice on the phone. You get a bit more of her sexual awakening, and in particular her Julia Child influence sexual awakening, and just how she like gets a lot from Julia's spirit, not necessarily like the ins and outs of who she was. Like she comes to peace that she met her in real life, they might not actually get along, but this Julia in her head, positive, encouraging person in her life, and through the Julia and Julia project that she does really help her sort of turn her life around or steer it in a direction that brings her more joy. It's not very vegan at all. There's a lot of lobster killing, not just one like there is in the film. She has to do that a lot of times. There's offal, brains, liver, is it what's it called, aspic, like carb foot set jelly. And she has lots of digs at vegans, but honestly it's 2002, I don't really care, it's all fine. I'm sure she's become a bit more open-minded about that, as we all have. It did feel it dragged on slightly, but it was a very enjoyable read. I sort of wish I was reading it like on a holiday where I could just not feel like, alright, come on, let's keep moving. She has a very bubbly voice and like does some descriptions of her kitchen at the end of a year of cooking 524 recipes. Very likable. So that's everything I read. Now the segment I said I would do at the end of each month is, if I could, which books would I actually buy? Luckily I did or have acquired 2 of them. So glad I bought this, and this book is Bury Me. I'm glad I saw it at an op shop. And then the other book that I'm sure we will be buying and probably buying for other dog loving friends is all of Mabel Me. But the rest, yeah, I'm kind of good that I don't have. So I'd love to hear obviously what you read this month. If you read any of the books that I read, what you thought about my thoughts. What are your thoughts? You get the gist. Let's talk books. Okay, see you next month, and in the comments, lots of love. Bye.